Hello. In this video, I want to talk to you about a concept called incremental cash flows, or as it relates to your operating cash flows. Um, the this concept of incremental cash flows is very important in determining the right set of cash flows to look at to help you make a business decision. And there are some subtleties to it. And so the learning objective is for you to be able to explain this concept and why it makes sense in terms of making business decisions, and do that using examples of your own design. And in the process, be sure to discuss, how maybe sort of in the simple case, if I'm making a business decision that's really unrelated to the existing business operations, that might show itself. The incremental cash flow idea might be represented, versus maybe if you have something that's related and possibly cannibalizing your existing business. I know when I say this, people are like, "Oh, I love that! I get to talk about cannibals in a business class." We'll talk about what that is, and then how to think about that in terms of allocating fixed costs and what we call sunk costs. So, first thing, let's talk about just the incremental cash flows and what the idea behind this is. So, incremental cash flows are intended to reflect the change in cash flows. You know how I am. I got to fix my PowerPoint. They reflect the change in cash flows from making a decision versus doing nothing. And so, the easy way to think about it is, imagine that you have developed a set of cash flows for how your business cash flows would be if you took a particular decision, right? A business decision, and you felt like, whether that's an investment or whatever it is, you should take this change. And then you already have a set of forecasts that reflect what if you made no change. And so think of it as the new OCFs versus the OCFs under the current scenario. The net impact to you of making the change is the difference between those. So it's OCF new minus OCF current, right? And you would be doing that sort of period by period by period. And so you could sort of line up the projections for each period going forward, new versus current, take the difference, and that becomes the incremental impact of taking the decision. And so when we talk about incremental cash flows, think of it that way. It's as though, imagine two scenarios, one where we do nothing, the other where we take this decision. Imagine projecting out and doing a forecast for both of them, and then simply taking the difference between those two forecasts. All right. So in an unrelated business decision, the way that this might play out is that quite frankly, you would do. You could just look at the business idea by itself. Maybe you've got something that says, I'm going to launch a new product, let's say, and launching the new product, it's going to have its own customer base, its own sales force, its own production facility. It's going to have its own expenses that we can track separately. It's not going to take away any of the sales from anybody else. It's not going to lead to, it's not going to share any of the facilities, and so there's really no relationship. It's almost as though we're going to go buy another building, put all of our stuff in it, create this new product and sell it, and it's going to be its own sort of freestanding business, if you will. In that case, you can simply represent the benefit of taking the decision as the cash flows for the new product. And in fact, that's more or less what you guys are doing when you're starting from scratch with nothing and evaluating your business ideas. You're effectively saying, incrementally, I start out with no cash flows, and so whatever cash flows I get from creating this business, that will be my incremental cash flows, right? For a business that's existing, if nothing's going to change about the existing business and all you've got is the new business you're going to bolt onto it, then you could just evaluate the bolt-on business and not need to do anything else. All right. An alternative scenario might be when you are cannibalizing your existing business. And in that case, what you're talking about is that your decisions might adversely impact the operating cash flows of your existing business. One of the most common situations that you might see there is, let's say that I am going to launch this new product, but it's similar enough to one of the existing products that I have, where when I launch the new product, I think some of the customers that used to buy my old product will stop buying my new product and instead buy the new product. And so, while if I just looked at the benefit that I'm going to get from the new product, that wouldn't be correct because it wouldn't capture the fact that I'm also losing some sales of the old product. So in that case, I really do need to do a full operating cash flow of the whole company under each of those two scenarios and take the difference, right? You might have the same thing happen in an opposite direction. If you, for example, have a product that maybe your new product can share some of the assets or the intellectual property, whatever, of an old product, so there's some benefit there. Or even better, sometimes companies will come out with a new product, and the introduction of the new product will not only add sales there, but it will add sales to some of the old products. And so that's called a synergy. All right. And in those cases, again, you would want to include in your analysis, well, I want my business idea to get credit not only for how much it causes in sales of the new product, but also how much it improves the sales of the old one. Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you're going to include the benefit of added sales for old products, then you in that scenario you have to include the consequence of lost sales of old products in the other scenario. And so in that case, again, it's generally easier to, rather than trying to unravel all of this, it's easier to say, let's just create two scenarios and two different teams. One of them is going to be the business as usual team, and the other one is going to be the, what do we project everything to be with the new product? How's it going to, projecting the entire, not just that product, but all the other products throughout, and then take the difference. So that's, you don't have to do that, but sometimes if things get really confusing, you just fall back on those two scenarios. And of course, if you have two teams doing that, then they're going to want to make sure that they're making consistent assumptions across. Here's another example where this incremental cash flow thing seems to pop its head up often. It's called allocated expenses. Some businesses have shared expenses that are shared across multiple groups, meaning, a simple example of that is how does everybody get charged for the cost of the CEO or the C-suite, right? They all benefit in some way from the fact that money is spent. So usually what you do is you have inside of your company some set of rules for how you decide how much of that total cost gets allocated to this business unit versus that business unit versus another. And when you take on a new project, or you're thinking about taking on a new project, sometimes the way that you go about doing the project could lead to a change in the way the expenses are allocated. It doesn't actually lead to a change in the total amount of the expenses. Nothing about that amount has changed for the company, but how much of it gets allocated to this business unit versus that business unit, or this concept versus that concept, or whatever, can change. One way that often happens is that sometimes the costs are allocated based on either total sales or total number of employees or something like that. And when you add the new product on, it now takes a piece of it, and so that reduces the share for the other that gets consumed in the other businesses. And so a lot of times what will happen is that somebody will want to say, well, we need to include in our analysis the fact that we lowered the allocated expenses for the other businesses. And the bottom line there is that those allocated expenses didn't change in total at all. And so on an incremental basis, if you said, let's just imagine a scenario where we did nothing and we calculate out, not as part of the cash flows, what the allocated expenses are, and then you figure out what would happen if you took this particular business decision or pursued this opportunity, and you figure out the shared expenses, and they're the exact same amount, then when you do new minus old for that part of it, it's going to come up to zero. And so you really didn't change the expenses at all. So you just shouldn't consider them at all in making the decision. Again, you technically, because I like doing this OCF new minus OCF current kind of analysis, you are including them in both of them, but you know full well that they're both going to cancel each other out. So bottom line, the wrong way to do it is that you would somehow account for the change in the allocation when there's no change in the actual total value of allocated expenses, just the way they're apportioned throughout the company. And the right way would be that if the amount is unchanged, then you shouldn't be included in the OCF, the incremental OCF at all. Now, I have to say this one time. If taking your decision does change the allocated expenses, or excuse me, the shared expenses, not just how they're proportioned, but the total amount of them for the company, if it makes them go up or go down, you need to capture that. That has to be in there. Let's talk about sunk cost. That's a term that not everybody's familiar with. This term really relates to instances where maybe you're coming up on a business decision, and as part of that, somebody has acknowledged that, we already spent money on X, and we did that last year thinking that would put us in a better position to maybe do this today. All right. But now we have to make the decision today whether or not we're going to do it or not. So do we or do we not include in our calculation the money that we already spent? And the bottom line on that is again, kind of revert back to your incremental analysis as of the point in time you're making the decision. You're making the decision today to either do something or do nothing. If you do something, you'll get whatever those benefits are. And you will include in that the fact that, hey, we spent this sunk cost. If you do nothing, you won't get the benefits, but you still have already spent the sunk cost. You can't unspend it. And so when you take the difference between the new and the current, those sunk costs wash out. They are not part of the incremental cash flows because they're not changed in any way by the decision. And so the wrong thing to do is to try to include those sunk costs in your incremental cash flows. They shouldn't show up. And you can solve that by including them in both your current and your new model, taking the differences, and it washes out to zero. All right? That would be, so the right thing is you put you either, if you're doing a current versus new version, then you put the sunk cost in both of them so they wash out. If you're not, if you're trying to create this single version that reflects just the changes, you don't include the sunk costs in those changes. All right, and that's really it. This incremental cash flow thing, I know people sort of get confused a lot of times by it. So I'm just going to leave you with, I've said this probably 20 times already, but with this visual, which is really think in terms of two scenarios, two full sets of financials, operating cash flows, one if you do nothing, the other if you do something, and then a third that is the difference between those two. That third that is the difference between them, that's the incremental impact of doing something, and that's what you want to be thinking about in terms of your decisions. All right. Well, as before, if as you're going through and working through this, you have any issues or confusions, bring them to class so we can discuss them. Thank you.